The crowd held its breath as the twin suns dipped behind the ridge, turning the punishment square into a bowl of red and gold light. And in the center of that light stood the alien girl with her wrists bound and her head lowered, her long silver hair falling like a curtain that hid the fear trembling in her shoulders. She was young, maybe 17 in human years, and her people's law said anyone who crossed the border wall after curfew must face 10 lashes. No questions asked, no mercy granted. The Lashmaster lifted his whip with a slow, cruel pride as if he enjoyed the silence that followed his movements. And the crowd watched because they were taught to watch and never interfere. Not when the law spoke. Not when the lash cracked. Among them stood Kale, a human soldier stationed on the moon for peacekeeping duty, his armor dusty from patrols and his mind heavy with how quickly injustice could be painted as tradition. He had seen the girl earlier in the day carrying herbs for the elderly in her district. She had not been causing trouble. She had simply run late while helping someone weaker than herself. Now she stood trembling in front of a punishment meant to break spirits and keep fear alive. Kale felt a quiet storm building in his chest. Something human and stubborn. Something he learned long before he ever put on a soldier's badge. The Lashmaster drew back his arm and the whip hissed like a living snake. The crowd tensed, some flinched, but no one moved. Not until Kyle stepped forward, his boots echoing across the stone as if the ground itself gasped. The Lashmaster froze and stared at him with irritation that quickly shifted into disbelief. Kale lifted his hand slowly and spoke in a calm voice that carried through the square. He said he would take the lashes for her under the ancient treaty of proxy suffering, a forgotten rule written generations ago when humans and aliens first tried to form peace. The Lashmaster laughed as if a human volunteering for pain was comedy. But the law still allowed it, and the crowd murmured with a mixture of shock and confusion. The girl finally raised her face and her bright violet eyes widened when she saw him standing in front of her. She shook her head desperately, but Kale only nodded once in silent reassurance. The guards unbound her and replaced her with him, stripping off the upper half of his armor and leaving his back exposed to the fading suns. The first lash fell with a sound that cracked the square open, striking his skin with a force that made many look away. But Kale stayed still, his hands gripping the iron post, his breath steady even as pain spread like fire across his spine. The girl moved forward, but a guard held her back. She called out that she never asked for this. But Kale managed a tight smile over his shoulder and told her she didn't need to ask, because some things were simply right to do. The second lash tore the skin. The third forced a grunt from him. By the fourth, the crowd saw blood running down his sides like dark streams in the dying light. But something else began to change too. The murmurs of shock shifted into murmurs of shame. The people who once accepted the punishment law now saw a stranger taking their cruelty upon himself just to spare a young girl. Elders lowered their eyes. Mothers held their children tighter. And a quiet fury lit inside those who had been silent for too long. By the sixth lash, Kale's knees trembled and he pressed his forehead against the cold post to stay upright. The girl begged the Lashmaster to stop, tears streaking down her face. But the Lashmaster only sneered and raised the whip higher as if proving he could break a human would restore his pride. Kale's breath hitched, but he did not fall. He stared at the ground as if carving his will into the stone, and each lash etched a different truth into the hearts of the crowd. By the ninth lash, his vision blurred, his back a map of open wounds. And yet he whispered to the girl that she would walk home free tonight. He would make sure of it. The 10th lash came down with brutal force and his body finally gave out. He dropped to his knees but refused to collapse completely, holding himself up on trembling arms until the Lashmaster declared the punishment complete. Silence drowned the square, thick enough to choke on. The girl ran to him and caught him before he fell fully to the ground, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding with her own scarf. Kale forced out a faint breath and said no law should ever make a child bleed. Then everything around him dimmed as if the suns had finally set inside his skull. That night torches lit the distant ridges as 3 shadows returned to the moon. The girl's warrior brothers armored in midnight metal and famous for their ferocity. The people whispered that when warriors of that clan kneel, it is an honor owed in blood and destiny. The crowd murmured that dawn would change everything because no clan, no council, no governor could ignore the truth written on the human's torn back. And as the stars deepened above the healing chambers where Kale lay barely conscious, a storm of fate gathered over the moon. A story ready to ignite, a world ready to shift, and an oath waiting to be born. Dawn broke slowly over the ridge as the twin suns rose like 2 burning eyes watching everything in silence. The light spilled across the valley and touched the healing hut where Kale lay on a narrow cot, his back wrapped in shimmering alien bandages that pulsed softly as they worked to close the wounds. He drifted in and out of half-sleep, hearing fragments of voices, footsteps, and the rustle of guards standing outside. The air smelled of herbs and metal, a mix of old tradition and new danger. Before the suns were fully up, the ground outside trembled with heavy steps. 3 tall figures approached in dark armor engraved with the markings of an ancient warrior clan. Their cloaks fluttered behind them like torn shadows. They moved with silent purpose, and the crowd parted instinctively, because everyone knew these were the brothers of Sarah. The girl Cale had taken the lashes for, Jarek the eldest with his cold, steady eyes, Voss the middle brother with the restless energy of a storm, and Talon the youngest with the quiet patience of someone who could wait a lifetime for justice. Their clan was feared across 3 star systems, not because they were cruel, but because their honor was unbreakable. They entered the hut without a word, and Sarah stood from beside Cale's bed, her face tired from a night of crying and tending to him. She wiped her eyes quickly as if afraid her brothers would see her softness as weakness. Jarek stepped closer to Cale and knelt, the metal of his armor scraping the floor. Then he bowed his head so low it surprised everyone watching from the doorway. Voss and Talon followed, dropping to one knee, their hands pressed to their chests in the ancient salute of absolute respect. The moment felt like the air itself bent under its weight. Because warriors of their status did not kneel lightly and never to a human. Cale forced his eyes open, struggling against the pain. He whispered that they did not owe him anything. But Jarek answered with a voice like carved stone, saying that a debt of this kind was older than law, older than treaties, older than the moons themselves. He said that anyone who takes pain meant for their blood becomes part of their blood. The clan accepts him as kin by deed, and from that moment his enemies become theirs. Cale tried to sit up, but the sharp fire in his back made him wince. Sarah moved to steady him, and Talon gently placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her they were grateful for what she had tried to do last night. They knew she had run to help a human at great personal risk. The kneeling of the brothers spread across the settlement like lightning. Soldiers, merchants, elders, and children whispered about it with disbelief. Some felt awe while others felt fear, because they knew the governor and his council would not tolerate a human gaining such influence among one of the most powerful clans on the moon. The punishment law had been a tool for control for decades, and Cale's act had cracked it open in front of everyone. The brothers rising in loyalty to him shattered the balance that kept the governor's authority intact. By mid-morning, a messenger from the council arrived with cold instructions. Cale was to be transferred off-world immediately for interfering in local law. The council demanded it for the sake of order. Jarek read the message and tore it in half without even blinking. He said no one would touch Cale without going through the clan first. The messenger paled and rushed back to the capital, fear shaking his steps. Sarah sat beside Cale again and gently changed the cooling stones on his injuries. She spoke quietly, telling him that what he did for her would never be forgotten. Cale managed a small, tired smile and said he simply did what felt right. She whispered that she wished more people felt right the way he did, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and confusion, because she still could not understand why a man from another world would choose suffering for someone he hardly knew. Outside the hut, the brothers argued in low voices. Voss was furious and wanted to storm the council chambers immediately. He said the governor had mocked their entire clan by allowing the Lashmaster to harm someone who acted with honor. Jarek warned that rushing into battle would only make things worse unless they had proof of corruption. Talon listened but kept glancing toward the forest path, sensing something watching them from afar. At noon, a scout hurried in with unsettling news. Shadowy figures had been seen near the old mining tunnels, men wearing black armor without clan symbols, the kind of mercenaries used by hidden groups who operated outside the law. Jarek's expression hardened because he knew exactly who they were. The Black Ledger, a powerful underground syndicate that profited from punishment labor and had paid the governor handsomely to keep the lash law in place. Cale's act had threatened their entire system, and the brothers knew they would strike soon. Cale struggled to sit despite the pain, saying he would not let others fight because of him. But Jarek placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that for now he must rest and let the clan handle what came next. Cale hesitated but agreed when Sarah pleaded softly, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the thought of losing him after he had already suffered so much. That night the settlement felt tense and watchful. The people lit small lanterns in their windows as a silent gesture of support. Even those who had once accepted the lash law now found courage in the human who stood in its path. The glow spread across the hills like a quiet rebellion, and the governor began to feel power slipping from his grip. Inside the hut, Cale drifted between pain and restless dreams, hearing echoes of the whip, the pleading voice of Sarah, and the vow of the brothers kneeling before him. The air outside grew colder as shadows moved across the ridge, unseen but drawing closer, and everyone sensed that the events of the next sunrise would change the fate of humans and aliens forever, because an oath had been formed in blood, and the world would soon rise or fall under its weight. Night settled over the valley like a slow dark wave, wrapping the settlement in shadows and quiet breaths of cold wind. Inside the healing hut, Cale forced himself to sit up despite the burning pain in his back. He hated lying still when danger circled the people who had protected him. The soft glow crystals hanging from the ceiling flickered as if reacting to his restless thoughts. Sarah entered with a small bowl of warm herbs. Her steps light but her eyes heavy with worry. She sat beside him and gently checked the bandages, her fingers trembling each time she saw the deep marks left by the lashes. Cale watched her in silence, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. Something both fragile and powerful. Something he could not name yet. "You shouldn't be moving," she whispered as she pressed a soothing cloth to his shoulder. He winced but didn't pull away. She asked him again why he had taken the lashes for her, when he could have walked away like everyone else. Cale looked at her and said it was because no law had the right to crush kindness. He had seen her helping an elder earlier that day, running to deliver medicine, and he couldn't stand the thought of her suffering because of something good she had done. Her eyes softened in a way that made him forget the pain for a moment. Before she could say more, the curtain at the entrance rustled and Jarek stormed in. His face pale with controlled anger, he carried a small data shard the size of a thumb. He placed it on the table and said he had taken it from a corrupted magistrate who tried to flee the capital. Cale narrowed his eyes, sensing the heaviness in Jarek's voice. Voss and Talon entered behind him, both tense and wired with worry. Jarek activated the shard and a series of glowing records hovered above the table. Lines of transactions, bribes, illegal shipments, and names linked to the Black Ledger. Cale scanned the data slowly, each entry revealing a deeper rot. The worst part came when the governor's seal appeared on multiple documents showing he had approved false charges against civilians to feed prisoners into labor mines off-world. Sarah gasped softly and covered her mouth, tears forming as she realized how many families had been destroyed under the mask of law. Voss slammed his fist against the wall and the sound shook the hut. He wanted to drag the governor into the square and expose him immediately, but Cale raised a weak hand and told them that rage without proof in the right place would only start a war they weren't ready for. He said the Star Court needed undeniable evidence, something so strong no corrupt voice could twist it. Jarek nodded slowly and said the core ledger was hidden in the punishment vault beneath the tribunal. Only a blood heir of the ruling line could open it. All eyes turned to Sarah. Her breath quickened as she realized what they were asking. She hesitated, not from fear of danger but from the weight of what it meant. Entering the vault meant defying the governor openly, risking exile or worse. But when she looked at Cale's injuries and then at the glowing list of victims, she straightened her shoulders and said she would go. Cale whispered that she didn't need to put herself in more danger, but Sarah replied that he had risked everything for her without even knowing her name. Now it was her turn to fight for the truth. The brothers began preparing for the mission with swift precision. Talon pulled out cloaking dust and old clan tools. Voss checked his blades while muttering about how many guards he hoped would try to stop them. Jarek studied security patterns and marked safe routes under the tribunal. Cale tried to stand, but the pain cut through him like a burning wire. Sarah moved to him instantly, her hands on his arms, her voice firm but gentle as she told him he had done enough for now. Still, he refused to sit back entirely. He guided them with tactical knowledge from his years in off-world service, explaining how patrols move, how to avoid scanners, how to force distractions without raising alarms. The brothers listened carefully, their respect for him deepening with every word. After midnight, the settlement fell silent. Lanterns dimmed and a cold haze settled over the ground. The team gathered at the back gate dressed in dark robes and light armor. Cale stood with them even though he couldn't join the heist. He placed a hand on Sarah's wrist and wished her safety. She looked at him with a steady gaze that held both fear and something softer, something unspoken she promised she would return. The brothers moved like shadows, leading her through narrow paths lit only by starlight. Their breaths quiet, their footsteps softer than wind on stone. Cale watched them disappear into the darkness, a heavy unease curling in his chest. He sensed that something unseen was moving through the hills, something waiting. Hours passed slowly. Stretching like long, painful threads, Cale couldn't rest. He paced outside despite the sting in his back, every second feeling heavier than the last. Then from the far ridge he saw faint moving lights, not from his allies but from mercenary scouts, black ledger eyes hunting in silence. Their steps too quiet, too coordinated, too hungry. Cale realized the corruption they faced was deeper than the governor alone. Inside the tribunal tunnel, Sarah and the brothers reached the vault door, glowing with ancient family symbols. Sarah placed her hand on the reader and the stone shifted with a deep rumble, revealing the heart of the truth they needed. But in the shadows behind them, a faint metallic click echoed, a sound no one had made, a sound that didn't belong to any of them, and in that moment Cale's heart tightened, because he knew the moon's quiet balance was about to shatter, and the night would no longer hide what hunted them. The fight for truth had begun, and none of them could turn back now. The tunnels beneath the tribunal breathed cold air as if the stone itself remembered every secret ever buried in its halls. Sarah stepped into the vault chamber with her pulse racing, the ancient symbols on the door still glowing faintly from her touch. Shadows stretched long across the floor, and every heartbeat in her chest felt loud enough to echo. Jarek moved ahead with slow, careful steps while Voss kept to her right, blades ready, and Talon crouched near a panel of glowing wires, listening for the soft hum of traps or triggers. Inside the vault, the air felt heavy, as if centuries of hidden crimes had gathered there waiting to be seen. Shelves of data crystals lined the walls and a single pedestal stood in the center, holding the core ledger. A smooth black cube carved with the seal of the ruling line. Sarah walked toward it with trembling hands. She could feel the weight of her ancestors in the stones around her, some honorable, some corrupted, all part of the legacy she now had to challenge. She pressed her palm to the cube and her bloodline symbol glowed across its surface. The ledger opened like unfolding glass, revealing streams of data that illuminated the chamber in cold blue light. Her breath caught when she saw the truth laid bare. The governor's signature approving illegal transfers of prisoners, orders to silence families who questioned the disappearances, messages exchanged with the Black Ledger offering profit in return for control. Jarek's jaw tightened. Voss muttered a curse under his breath, and Talon's eyes darkened with quiet fury. Then Voss froze, his instinct sparking first. He whispered for everyone to stay silent. The others held their breath. The chamber felt still but not empty. Jarek scanned the dark corners and saw a faint glint of metal. He motioned for Sarah to stay back. But before he finished the warning, the vault door slammed shut with a violent clang that shook dust from the ceiling. A mechanical click echoed through the chamber like the snarl of a triggered beast. Black Ledger mercenaries stepped out of the shadows, their armor matte black, their visors pulsing red. They had followed the group through the tunnels, waiting for the moment the vault opened so they could trap them inside. One of the mercenaries raised a shock rifle and fired. The bolt hit the pedestal, sending sparks across the stone. Sarah ducked behind Jarek as he drew his blade with a fluid motion. Voss lunged first, moving like a burst of lightning as he slashed at a mercenary blocking the exit. Metal clashed with metal. Sparks sprang against the vault walls. Talon dove to the side, rolling behind a crate. Before pulling out a small device from his belt, he twisted the dial and pressed it to the floor. A pulse of energy rippled outward, disrupting some of the mercenary visors and causing their lights to flicker. Sarah clutched the ledger close and tried to stay low, her hands shaking as the room exploded with motion. Jarek blocked a strike aimed at her and countered with a swift move that sent the attacker crashing into a shelf of data crystals. The crystals shattered and scattered across the floor like fallen stars. More mercenaries forced their way in, and the chamber grew crowded with danger. Voss fought with wild precision, each movement a balance of fury and control. Talon used small explosives to create barriers of smoke and sparks. Jarek stayed close to Sarah, shielding her from every angle. But even with their skill, they were outnumbered and pushed toward the back wall. Outside the tunnels, Cale pushed himself through the forest path. Despite the burning agony in his back, he had seen mercenary scouts moving at dusk and felt dread settle in his bones. He knew the brothers and Sarah were walking into a trap. He ignored the stabbing pain and kept moving, gripping tree roots and rocks to stay upright as he forced himself toward the tribunal, every step scraping fire through his wounds. But nothing mattered except reaching them in time. Inside the vault, the mercenaries activated drones that hovered like metal vultures scanning for targets. One drone shot a bolt that grazed Sarah's shoulder. She stumbled and the ledger nearly slipped from her grasp. Jarek caught her and pulled her behind him while swinging his blade upward to slice through a drone. It fell to the ground, sparking and twitching. The mercenary leader stepped forward, tall and armored heavily, his voice distorted through a mask. He told them the ledger was never meant to see daylight. The governor had promised payment for its destruction. He ordered Sarah to hand it over or die with her brothers. Sarah's breath trembled, but she held the ledger tighter, her eyes burning with defiance. She said if the truth had to be protected with blood, then her clan would bleed before bowing to lies. The leader raised his rifle and aimed directly at her chest. The brothers moved as one to block the shot. But before he could fire, an explosion shook the entire tunnel. Dust rained from the ceiling, lights flickered, and a second shockwave blasted open part of the wall. The mercenaries stumbled and looked back, confusion rippling through their ranks. Kale limped into the breach, wounded. Breathless, but standing with a stun rifle held steady in his hands. His voice cracked with pain and determination as he told them they would not touch her. He fired a bolt that knocked a mercenary off his feet. Voss let out a fierce grin and charged forward with renewed fire. Talon detonated his last barrier device, creating a screen of smoke. Jarek took the opening and began pushing the group toward the exit. Sarah ran to Kale and helped him steady himself. He smiled weakly and told her he wasn't going to let the night take her away. She held on to him with a trembling breath, the ledger safe in her arms. They pushed through the broken wall into the tunnel as mercenaries regrouped behind them. The chase echoed through the stone passages, each breath filled with fear and hope, each step pulling them closer to a fate none of them could predict. And as they fled into the darkness with the truth burning in Sarah's hands and Kale struggling to stay on his feet, the world above them shifted, the delicate balance of law and power breaking apart as a new future began to rise from the shadows. The battle for justice had only just begun, and the moon was waking to the storm that would change everything. Dawn crept over the mountains with a pale, trembling light, as if the sky itself was unsure of what the new day would bring. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, and the valley lay silent, except for the distant hum of gathering crowds. Kale walked between Jarek and Voss with slow, painful steps, every movement sending fire across his back. Sarah stayed close on his other side, carrying the core ledger pressed tightly to her chest. She kept glancing at him with worried eyes, as if fearing that at any moment he might collapse again. But Kale forced himself forward because today could decide everything for humans and aliens on this moon. Ahead of them, the great stone circle waited on the hilltop, ancient pillars rising like teeth toward the sky. Families and warriors and elders surrounded it in waves of tense silence. The matriarch stood at the center, holding her staff carved with symbols older than any government. She had called the trial by dawn, a ritual where truth was revealed under the eyes of the suns. The governor stood opposite her with a squad of soldiers wearing polished armor and false confidence, his face strained with anger barely contained. He glared at Kale with a look that said he wanted to bury the human under the law forever. The moment Kale entered the circle, whispers spread across the crowd. Some pointed at the bandages on his back, others bowed their heads in respect. Sarah walked beside him with quiet dignity, her brothers following like protective shadows. The governor stepped forward and raised his hand, ordering Kale's arrest for sedition. He claimed the human had manipulated the princess, broken into the tribunal, stolen private documents, and interfered with sacred punishment law. His words dripped with fear disguised as authority, but the matriarch lifted her staff and the governor fell silent. She announced that today belonged to truth alone. No title, no threat, no bribe could silence the voice of justice. She turned to Sarah and asked her to step forward. Sarah took a trembling breath and entered the center of the circle. The crowd leaned in, watching her small figure stand before the powerful governor without fear. She held up the ledger and the blue light glowed across her face as she spoke of corruption, forced punishments, stolen lives, and the lies used to justify cruelty. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the ledger projected its records into the air, line after line of secret orders signed by the governor. Families wiped tears as they recognized the names of loved ones taken away. Elders cried out in grief and anger. The governor tried to shout that it was forged, but Jarek stepped forward and declared that the vault itself had recognized Sarah's bloodline. No forged document could have opened the door. Then Kale stepped into the circle, leaning on Voss for support. His voice raw but steady as he spoke of what he had seen on other worlds, how law could be twisted into a weapon, how fear could be used to control entire nations. He told them that when he saw Sarah on the square that day, He knew the law had lost its soul. He said no world could remain free while its leaders fed on the suffering of innocence. His words carried through the valley like a slow-rising storm. The governor's face contorted with rage. He ordered his soldiers to seize Kale immediately, but not a single soldier moved. Some lowered their weapons, too shaken by the truth glowing above them. Others stepped back uncertain. The matriarch raised her staff again and declared that the ledger would be sent to the Star Court for universal judgment. She stripped the governor of authority on the spot, naming his crimes one by one, but corruption rarely surrenders quietly. The governor signaled a hidden group at the edge of the ridge. Black Ledger mercenaries stepped forward armed and ready, their rifles humming with lethal charge. They refused to accept the ruling and shouted that the punishment law belonged to them. The crowd panicked as the mercenaries prepared to fire into the circle. Sarah screamed Kyle's name as the leader aimed his weapon directly at the human's heart. Before the shot could fire, Kale lunged forward and shoved Sarah aside. The blade of a mercenary slashed across his shoulder, opening fresh wounds. He staggered but kept fighting. Jarek and Voss clashed with the mercenaries in a burst of metal and sparks. Talon hurled a smoke charge to shield the civilians. Chaos erupted around the circle as families shielded their children, and warriors tried to push them toward safety. Kale fought through the pain with a desperate strength, blocking a strike meant for Jarek. Catching the blade with his forearm, blood running down his skin in bright lines, Jarek shouted for him to fall back, but Kale refused. He said the truth had cost too much to let it die on this mountain. His voice strained but unbroken. The mercenary leader charged towards Sarah, yelling that if they killed the heir, the ledger would mean nothing. Kale threw himself in front of her again, refusing to let her suffer another blow meant for him. Talon dove forward and knocked the leader off balance. Voss slammed into another attacker with enough force to break his visor. The crowd watched, with wide eyes as humans and aliens fought side by side for the first time in living memory. The matriarch struck her staff against the stone and the sound boomed through the valley. She declared the trial decided, the ledger true, and the governor guilty. No mercenary had authority to change that. Her voice thundered like the suns themselves were speaking. As the last of the mercenaries retreated into the trees, promising to return with greater force, the hilltop fell into a heavy silence. Kale's knees buckled and he nearly fell. Sarah caught him with shaking arms, tears burning her eyes. She whispered that he had saved her life again and again. Kale smiled faintly and said he would do it 1,000 times more. But even as the people rallied around them with cheers and cries of hope, a deeper fear settled in the air. Because everyone knew Black Ledger would not accept defeat. The battle for justice was not over, and the storm gathering on the horizon promised a war that would test every heart on the moon. Kale looked at the rising suns through the pain and whispered that they would face whatever came next together. With truth in their hands and courage in their blood, night fell like a heavy curtain across the valley, pulling every sound into a tense, trembling silence. Fires burned on the ridgelines as the clans prepared for the coming battle, and the air tasted like cold metal and rising fear. Kyle stood at the edge of the hill overlooking the settlement. His bandages tight across his wounds, every breath sharp but steady. He refused to rest because he could feel the storm approaching. The kind of storm that changes the fate of worlds. The kind that starts with a whisper and ends with fire. Behind him, warriors moved with urgent purpose, sharpening blades, checking rifles, murmuring prayers in old alien tongues. Sarah stood among them, handing out healing salves and small vials of light medicine, her hands shaking each time she glanced toward Kale. She feared he was pushing his body past its limit, but she also knew he would not step back while danger aimed itself at her people, her clan, and the fragile hope they had built around truth. Talon climbed the ridge to Kale's side, carrying a small device wrapped in sealcloth. He said the Black Ledger mercenaries had gathered forces in the far canyons, their dropships landing through the night like dark birds. Scouts had seen heavy armor rolling into position. They wanted revenge for the truth exposed at the trial. They wanted to burn away every trace of the ledger and silence anyone who protected it. Kale took a deep breath and nodded. He said the clans had one advantage. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their future. Mercenaries fought only for coin, and coin never outweighed conviction. Jarek approached with a tired grimness in his eyes. He told Kale the matriarch had named him co-commander of the defense, a title unheard of for a human. Kale felt a sharp sting of emotion as Jarek clasped his arm and said that destiny sometimes chose strange paths, but this one felt right. Kale answered that he would give everything he had left to keep their people safe. Jarek replied that he already had. The first blast shook the valley before anyone could speak again. A deep thunder that cracked through the night as the mercenaries fired on the outer ridge. Flaming debris tumbled down the slopes and warriors rushed into formation. Voss sprinted past Kale, shouting orders, his voice sharp with the energy of battle as he rallied the frontline fighters. Talon slipped into the shadows to set explosive traps along the canyon edges. Jarek drew his blade and placed himself at the head of the hill defense. Sarah grabbed Kale's wrist before he moved, her eyes full of fear and something deeper. She whispered that he should stay back, he was hurt. He had already done enough. Kale looked at her with soft, steady eyes and told her that he could not stand behind walls while she faced danger alone. She pressed her hand against his chest and felt his rapid heartbeat. She whispered for him to come back alive. No matter what, he promised he would try. The second blast hit closer, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Kale ran with Jarek to the ridgeline. The night lit with streaks of red and blue as energy bolts ripped through the air. War cries rose from both sides as mercenaries flooded the valley, their armor glinting like black mirrors. Kale took cover behind a stone slab and fired his stun rifle with precise discipline, dropping 2 mercenaries before they reached the front line. He felt his back ache but forced the pain down, focusing only on protecting the ridge. The mercenaries pushed forward with brutal force, shock rifles crackling, drones swarming overhead. Jarek clashed with their leader in a whirl of sparks as metal met metal. Voss charged into the fray like a storm breaking open, knocking soldiers aside with fierce strikes. Kale fought beside them, blocking blows, disarming attackers, using his training to guide the defense with calm, sharp control. Even through pain, he moved with purpose, refusing to give an inch. Then the mercenaries unleashed their armored crawler, a massive machine rolling up the canyon like a beast with glowing jaws, its cannons charged with deadly light. The clans faltered, fear rippling through the lines as the ground vibrated under the machine's weight. Talon shouted from the far ridge that he could collapse part of the canyon but needed time. Kale shouted for everyone to hold the line and buy Talon that time. The crawler fired a blast that tore through the front barricade. Warriors thrown backward in clouds of dust and debris. Kale pushed through the chaos to reach Jarek. Together they struck the machine's legs with explosives, but the armor held. Voss climbed onto the crawler's side, stabbing at the joints until sparks burst from its gears. The machine roared and swatted him off, sending him crashing into the rocks. Sarah saw it happen and screamed his name before sprinting toward him with medics close behind. Kale's heart pounded as the crawler aimed another cannon toward the ridge. Toward Sarah, toward the families taking shelter behind the stone circle. He shouted for Talon to detonate the charges. Talon's voice came through the comm, shaking with fear and determination as he yelled that the mercenaries were closing in on him. But he would not fail. A heartbeat later, the canyon wall erupted in a thunderous explosion. Rock and earth cascaded down like a collapsing mountain, blocking the crawler's path and crushing its lower half. The machine cracked and fell on its side, sparks bursting from its core as the mercenaries retreated in panic. Silence followed, heavy and unreal, broken only by the crackle of burning debris and the fading hum of broken machinery. The clans began to cheer weakly, exhausted but alive. Sarah ran to Kale and threw her arms around him, her breath shaking against his shoulder as she whispered that she thought she had lost him. Kale held her close as the night wind cooled the sweat on his skin. He whispered that he wasn't going anywhere, not while she still needed him. The matriarch stepped onto the ridge and raised her staff, declaring that the moon would no longer bow to fear or corruption. The punishment law would be rewritten, the black ledger banished, and justice rebuilt from truth and unity. Kyle stood among the warriors, his body aching, his breath uneven, but his spirit burning with a new fire. The battle had been won, but the future still waited on the horizon, trembling with the weight of new dawns and new dangers. Yet for the first time since Kale arrived on the moon, hope felt stronger than fear, and as Sarah took his hand, her fingers warm against his, he felt destiny shifting again, pulling them toward a fate neither of them could walk alone. The night after the battle felt strangely quiet. A quiet so deep it almost felt like the moon was holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. The fires on the ridge burned low and soft wind carried the scent of smoke and healing herbs through the valley. Kale sat on a stone near the edge of the hill, wrapped in a thick cloak to hide the trembling pain in his back. The wounds had opened during the fight and every movement felt like fire sliding under his skin, but he stayed awake because he wanted to watch the suns rise. He wanted to see what a new world looked like after truth had survived the night. Footsteps approached softly behind him. He didn't turn because he already knew whose steps they were. Sarah sat beside him, her cloak brushing his shoulder. She didn't say anything at first. She simply watched the horizon with him, her hands clasped in her lap, the faint glow of dawn reflecting in her bright violet eyes. Cale admired her strength, the way she carried the weight of her people and her family without letting it crush her. She had faced danger with courage that inspired even the hardest warriors, and now she sat quietly beside him, as if the silence between them held its own kind of meaning. After a long moment, she whispered that she had been afraid when she saw him fall during the battle, afraid in a way she had never felt before. Cale listened to her words, feeling them settle deep in his chest. He told her he had been afraid too. Not of dying, but of leaving her alone in the middle of the storm. Sarah's breath caught as if the truth in his voice had reached something fragile inside her. She turned to him fully, and her fingers gently touched the bandage beneath his cloak, her touch warm and careful. Down below, the clans gathered in the stone circle again, not for judgment or battle, but for rebuilding. Families carried out tools. Children collected fallen debris. Warriors helped mend broken walls. The settlement that had once lived under fear now moved with a new sense of purpose. Unity flowed through them like a shared heartbeat. The matriarch stood in the center, giving quiet instructions to leaders and scholars, preparing the documents to rewrite the punishment law and send the ledger to the Star Court. Jarek walked up the hill with Voss and Talon close behind him, all three wearing signs of battle, but holding themselves with pride. They approached Cale with a deep, respectful silence. Jarek placed a beautifully carved torque in Kyle's hands, a mark of kinship given only to those who had proven themselves through sacrifice. Voss grinned and said Cale had earned it 3 times over. Talon nodded and said the clan now stood as his family whether he liked it or not. Cale laughed softly at that, a tired breath that carried both pain and gratitude. He thanked them, his voice rough but sincere. When the brothers stepped back, the matriarch approached, her staff tapping lightly against the stone. She looked at Cale with wise, steady eyes and told him the Star Court had already responded. They would send new judges and peacekeepers within the week. The ledger would be protected, justice would be honored, and the governor's allies would face their reckoning. She said the moon needed someone to guide the transition, someone trusted by both humans and aliens, and she asked Cale if he would stay as guardian of the charter. Cale felt the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle made of hope and responsibility. Before he could answer, Sarah stepped forward, her voice soft but strong as she said she wanted him to stay. She said he had changed her world. He had changed her beliefs. He had shown her courage that didn't come from bloodline or strength, but from choosing what was right even when it came with pain. Cale looked at her, the rising suns catching the silver strands of her hair and turning them into fire. He felt something shift in him, something that had been waiting quietly through days of wounds and nights of danger. He stood slowly, ignoring the sharp ache in his spine, and took her hands in his. He told her he would stay not because of duty or titles, but because he could not imagine leaving a world that had given him purpose, and a person who had given him something even deeper. Sarah's eyes filled with a soft, trembling light as she whispered that destiny sometimes speaks in pain and flame, but sometimes it speaks in the quiet moments when 2 people choose each other without saying the word love. The first rays of morning sunlight touched the stone circle, bathing the valley in gold. Warriors lowered their weapons, families held each other, and children pointed at the sky as flocks of bright-winged birds flew across the dawn, a symbol of renewal long forgotten. The matriarch lifted her staff and declared the birth of a new era, free of fear, free of cruelty, shaped by truth and protected by those who had fought for it with heart and honor. Cale and Sarah stood side by side, watching the world wake into its new shape. Her hand curled around his arm, his heart beat steady beneath her touch, and as the suns rose higher, the valley filled with a warmth that felt like promise, like healing, like a future no longer chained to the past. The battle was over, the truth had survived, and destiny had opened a new path for them. A path they would walk together, step by step, heart by heart, into whatever came next.